The gym was one of those 24-hour facilities tucked away in a quiet strip mall. Its neon sign buzzed faintly outside, flickering against the otherwise still night. Inside, the air smelled of rubber mats, faint sweat, and the citrusy tang of cleaner. The lighting was harsh but uneven, casting long shadows across rows of machines. Mirrors lined the walls, reflecting every corner, yet somehow made the space feel smaller, as though something unseen lingered just beyond their reach. Lena had joined the gym 2 weeks ago. After years of battling self-doubt and the quiet gnawing of anxiety, she finally mustered the courage to start working on herself. She'd moved to the city for a fresh start, hoping the rhythmic hum of treadmills and the clanging of weights would drown out the whispers of loneliness that followed her everywhere. Her usual routine was to come late at night, avoiding the crowded rush of post-work gym-goers. She liked the quiet, or at least she thought she did. That night, the gym was nearly empty, save for a man on the far side doing pull-ups and a receptionist scrolling on his phone at the front desk. The machines stood like silent sentinels, their metal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. As Lena warmed up on the treadmill, her thoughts drifted, the rhythmic sound of her steps blending with the faint hum of the air conditioning. She felt almost peaceful until she noticed something in the mirror. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement near the free weights. She slowed her pace and glanced over, but there was nothing there. Just the empty space where the mirrors reflected the neatly stacked dumbbells. She shook her head, chalking it up to exhaustion or the strange way shadows played tricks under the fluorescent glow. But when she returned her gaze to the mirror, she saw it again. This time, it wasn't a shadow, but a figure, just a fleeting glimpse of someone stepping behind the row of machines. Her heart thudded as she stepped off the treadmill, scanning the room. The man doing pull-ups was still at his station, oblivious to her unease. She hesitated, then told herself it was probably nothing. Maybe the receptionist had moved, or her tired mind was playing tricks. She moved to the squat rack, gripping the cold steel bar as she tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. The weights felt heavier than usual, the silence pressing in on her like a physical weight. The man doing pull-ups had disappeared, and even the receptionist was no longer at his desk. Lena suddenly felt very alone. As she adjusted her grip on the bar, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the locker rooms. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound wasn't hurried but deliberate, each step slow and measured. She glanced toward the locker room door, half expecting to see someone emerge, but it remained still. Her pulse quickened as she debated whether to investigate or leave. Then the sound stopped, leaving only the hum of the air conditioning. Trying to steady herself, Lena returned to her workout. But as she lowered the bar after her second set, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The mirrors on the far wall were no longer reflecting her movements accurately. There was a delay, almost imperceptible, but once she noticed it, she couldn't unsee it. When she turned her head, her reflection lingered for just a fraction of a second before following. Her chest tightened as she stared into the glass, her reflection staring back with wide, panicked eyes. The footsteps resumed, louder this time, and distinctly coming closer. She whipped around, expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the gym floor was empty. Her instincts screamed for her to leave, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting the room into brief moments of shadow. She tried to move toward the exit, but her reflection in the mirror didn't follow. Instead, it stood frozen, watching her with an expression that wasn't quite hers. A deep, guttural whisper filled the air, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You don't belong here." Lena stumbled backward, her eyes darting around the room as the sound of weights clanging echoed in the distance. The mirrors seemed to ripple, the reflections shifting and twisting into grotesque shapes. She ran for the door, her breath ragged, but the gym felt endless, as if the exit was retreating further with each step. When she finally burst through the doors into the cool night air, the gym fell silent behind her. She glanced back through the glass windows. The lights were steady now, the machines empty, and her reflection stood at the door, smiling. The next night, Lena found herself hesitating at the gym's entrance. The glass doors seemed to shimmer under the buzzing neon sign, and she couldn't shake the memory of her reflection staring back at her, detached and malevolent. She almost turned back, but told herself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination. "You can't let fear win," she whispered, pushing through the door. The receptionist wasn't at the desk tonight, though his water bottle and a half-eaten granola bar sat there, as if he'd just stepped away. The gym was eerily quiet again, the usual hum of treadmills replaced by a strange stillness. Every step she took echoed through the empty space, the sound unnervingly loud in the absence of others. Lena forced herself to stick to her routine. She picked a treadmill and started jogging, the rhythmic pounding of her feet filling the void. She kept her eyes straight ahead, avoiding the mirrors. But as her heart rate climbed, she noticed a faint sound, soft, like fabric brushing against metal. It was distant but growing closer, moving with an unnerving purpose. She slowed her pace, pulling her earbuds out to listen. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving her with only the thud of her heartbeat and the faint whir of the treadmill belt. She glanced around, but the gym was still empty. The locker room door swung slightly, as if caught by a breeze, though there was no air circulation that she could feel. Gathering her courage, she stepped off the treadmill and approached the locker room. The fluorescent lights above flickered as she walked, their buzzing growing louder with each step. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing the long rows of lockers, their surfaces dented and scratched with years of use. The faint scent of mildew lingered in the air, and the overhead lights cast strange shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as she moved. "Hello?" Lena called, her voice trembling. It echoed faintly before dying in the damp silence. A locker at the far end creaked open, the sound sharp and jarring in the stillness. She stepped closer, her breath quickening, only to find it empty. But something was off. A faint handprint, smeared and unnatural, glistened on the inside of the locker door, as though someone, or something, had been waiting there moments before. She backed away, her chest tight with panic, and stumbled into the gym's main area. The mirrors greeted her with their cold, unyielding gaze, and she felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her. Her own reflection looked pale and haggard, but as she stared, she noticed something horrifying. Behind her in the glass, a dark figure loomed, its shape barely discernible, as if it were made of the shadows themselves. Lena spun around, her eyes darting to where the figure should have been, but there was nothing there. The gym was empty, the mirrors mocking her with their cold, unbroken reflection of reality. She began to question her sanity. Had she really seen something? Was it just exhaustion? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she snatched it up, grateful for the distraction. It was a message from an unknown number. The text read, "Do you feel it watching you?" Her blood ran cold, and her hands trembled as she clutched the phone. Before she could process the message, the lights went out, plunging the gym into darkness. Her breathing was shallow as she fumbled for the flashlight on her phone. When it clicked on, the beam illuminated the closest machines, casting long, jagged shadows. The mirrors reflected the light back at her, but something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't holding a flashlight. It stood motionless, its face blank and featureless. A low hum filled the air, almost like a deep growl resonating through the walls. The sound grew louder, vibrating through her chest, as if the building itself were alive and angry. She tried to run for the door, but the beam of her flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in complete darkness. Then came the whispers. They surrounded her, overlapping in a cacophony of incomprehensible words. She turned in circles, trying to pinpoint their source, but they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As she strained to listen, a single voice cut through the chaos, clear and chilling. "You shouldn't have come back." Her instincts screamed for her to flee, but her legs felt heavy, as though the air itself had thickened. She managed to stumble forward, her hands outstretched, hoping to find the door. Instead, her fingers brushed against something cold and solid. It wasn't the door, but a weight machine, its metal frame icy to the touch. The lights flickered back on for a brief moment, and she caught a glimpse of the gym floor. It wasn't empty anymore. Figures, shrouded in shadow and barely human in form, stood scattered among the machines, their heads tilted unnaturally as they stared at her. Their eyes, or where eyes should have been, glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that seemed to pierce straight through her. She screamed and bolted toward the exit, her body propelled by sheer terror. The shadows moved with her, their presence suffocating and relentless. As she reached the doors and pushed them open, the cool night air hit her like a slap. She stumbled into the parking lot, her chest heaving as she turned to look back. The gym was silent and still. Through the windows, she saw the rows of machines, empty and unthreatening under the steady fluorescent lights. But in the far corner, near the mirrors, her reflection stood watching, its head tilted in an eerie mimicry of the figures she had just escaped. Lena didn't know why she returned to the gym the next night. Maybe it was a desperate need for answers, or perhaps a morbid curiosity that gnawed at her despite every instinct telling her to stay away. As she stood in the parking lot, the building seemed to loom larger than before, its neon sign flickering like a weak heartbeat. The glass doors reflected her pale, trembling face, but she pushed through them anyway, her stomach twisting in knots. The gym was silent, oppressively so. The usual hum of the air conditioning was gone, and the faint citrusy cleaner smell had been replaced with something metallic and sour. The receptionist's desk was abandoned again, but this time the granola bar was gone, replaced by a sticky, dark smear across the countertop. Lena stepped inside, her footsteps unnaturally loud against the rubber flooring. The mirrors reflected the dimly lit room, but their surfaces seemed off, almost liquid, as though they were barely holding their shape. She avoided looking directly into them, keeping her gaze fixed on the weight machines. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she whispered to herself, "Just get in, figure this out, and get out." A sudden crash echoed from the locker room, the sound sharp and violent. She flinched, her body instinctively tensing as adrenaline surged through her veins. Against her better judgment, she moved toward the noise, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, and her breath came out in faint white puffs. The locker room door was ajar, and a faint flickering light spilled into the hallway. She pushed the door open slowly, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Inside, the rows of lockers stood silent, but the far corner was drenched in shadow, the overhead lights blinking erratically. Something was there, crouched low, its outline barely visible against the darkness. "Hello?" she croaked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but the shadows seemed to ripple around it, as though the darkness itself were alive. She took a step closer, and the air grew thick, almost choking. Her skin prickled as the figure slowly rose, its movements jerky and unnatural. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its body was gaunt and elongated, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly, like dying embers. Its mouth hung open in a twisted grin, revealing jagged teeth that seemed to glisten in the flickering light. Lena stumbled back, her legs threatening to give out. The thing took a step forward, its movements accompanied by a wet, slithering sound. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She pounded on it, screaming, "Let me out!" The creature let out a guttural growl, low and resonant, that made her chest vibrate. It was closer now, impossibly fast, and she could feel the cold emanating from its twisted form. Desperate, she grabbed a metal dumbbell from the nearby rack, the weight solid and reassuring in her hands. She turned to face the thing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Stay back!" she screamed, raising the dumbbell. The creature tilted its head further, the sound of cracking bone filling the air as it let out a chilling, distorted laugh. It lunged at her, its movements a blur. Lena swung the dumbbell with all her strength, the metal connecting with a sickening thud. The thing staggered, letting out a piercing screech that echoed painfully in her ears. She didn't wait to see if it would recover. She bolted, weaving through the lockers, her only thought to escape. The mirrors in the locker room seemed to ripple as she passed, her own reflection screaming silently, its face twisted in terror. The whispers started again, louder this time, overlapping and growing in intensity until they were a deafening roar. The door to the gym floor finally gave way, and she stumbled out, tears streaming down her face. The gym was no longer familiar. The walls seemed to stretch endlessly, the fluorescent lights flickering wildly. The machines were twisted, their frames warped into grotesque shapes. Shadows moved between them, countless figures darting just out of view. Lena ran for the exit, but the glass doors were gone, replaced by a solid wall of mirrors. Her reflection stared back at her, dozens of versions of herself, all wearing expressions of despair and madness. She pounded on the glass, screaming, "Let me out, please!" Her reflection smiled, the same twisted grin as the creature in the locker room. It mouthed words she couldn't hear, but she knew what it was saying. "You can't leave." The shadows closed in, the whispers turning into a deafening roar. Lena felt cold hands grip her shoulders, pulling her back into the darkness. Her screams echoed through the empty gym, fading into silence as the lights flickered one last time and went out. When the gym reopened the next morning, it was as if nothing had happened. The machines were pristine, the mirrors gleamed, and the air carried the faint scent of citrus cleaner. But if you looked closely, in the far corner of the largest mirror, you might see the faint outline of a woman staring back, her face frozen in a silent scream. The gym reopened quietly the next morning, as if nothing had happened. The receptionist was back at his desk, chatting idly with a few regulars. No one mentioned the strange sounds or shadows, and no one asked about the faint scratches on the locker room doors or the mirrors that seemed just a little too clean. It was business as usual. But Lena wasn't there. At home, she sat curled up on her couch, staring blankly at the wall. The TV was on, but she wasn't watching. Her hands trembled, clutching the edge of a blanket that offered no comfort. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the creature, heard the whispers, felt the cold grip on her shoulders. She hadn't told anyone what happened. Who would believe her? The police would laugh her out of the station, and even her closest friends would chalk it up to stress or exhaustion. But she knew what she had seen. The bruises on her arms where the thing had grabbed her were proof enough. Every sound in her apartment made her jump. A creak in the floorboard sent her heart racing, and the reflection in her bathroom mirror made her stomach churn. She'd covered every reflective surface in her home, but the memory of her distorted reflection haunted her. She felt like she was being watched, even in the safest corners of her apartment. Back at the gym, the staff tried to ignore the unease that hung in the air. The receptionist occasionally glanced at the locker room door, his cheerful demeanor faltering for a split second before he shook it off. One of the trainers mentioned feeling off while working the late shift, but he laughed it away, blaming it on too much caffeine. Yet, some members had started to notice things. A faint buzzing sound in the mirrors, like static on a broken TV. Equipment that seemed to shift slightly when no one was looking. A pair of earbuds left on the treadmill that had been smeared with something dark and sticky. One woman swore she saw someone standing in the corner of the weight room late at night. A tall, thin figure that vanished when she turned on the lights. She canceled her membership the next day. Others followed, leaving the gym eerily empty during the night hours. The manager dismissed the rumors, chalking it up to overactive imaginations. But late at night, when he was alone in his office, he sometimes thought he heard faint whispers through the walls, voices that didn't belong to anyone he knew. Weeks later, a new member arrived. Young, eager, and oblivious to the strange looks exchanged between the staff and the remaining members. As they signed the paperwork, the receptionist handed them a gym-branded water bottle and gave them a tight smile. "Welcome," he said, his voice flat. "Just don't stay too late." The new member laughed, thinking it was a joke. But as they walked through the gym, they felt a faint chill. In the corner of the largest mirror, something shifted, a faint smudge like a handprint, fading just before they could look directly at it. She tried to rebuild her life, but nothing felt the same. Her once daily routines, grabbing coffee, walking through the park, or chatting with neighbors, felt alien, like she was out of sync with the world around her. Every reflective surface made her shudder, and she avoided them entirely. The distorted grin of her reflection in that cursed mirror haunted her, etched into her mind as clearly as if she'd seen it moments ago. But she wasn't free. At night, the whispers returned. Faint at first, like wind brushing against her windows. Then louder, creeping through her walls, her floors, her own thoughts. She would wake up drenched in sweat, convinced she'd heard footsteps pacing her hallway. She kept every light in the apartment on, but the shadows still seemed to crawl toward her. One night, she dared to look into her bathroom mirror. She had covered it with a towel, but in a moment of desperate bravery, or madness, she tore it down. For a moment she saw only herself, pale and haunted, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. Then the glass rippled, and there it was, the grin. Her reflection's mouth twisted unnaturally upward, its eyes dull and lifeless. She screamed and smashed the mirror with her fist, shards scattering across the sink and floor. Blood dripped from her knuckles, but she didn't feel the pain. The whispers stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence that made her ears ache. At the gym, things were no better. Membership dwindled until only the most oblivious or desperate clients remained. Staff turnover became a constant, with employees quitting after a few weeks, citing unease or unexplained incidents. The manager hung under-renovation signs on the locker rooms, but nothing ever changed. Late at night, the building seemed to breathe, its walls groaning as if under an unseen weight. The whispers never left entirely. Neither did the smudges in the mirrors. One trainer, working late to organize equipment, claimed he saw someone on the treadmill, tall, gaunt, with an unnaturally wide grin. When he looked again, the machine was empty, its belt eerily still. He quit the next day, leaving his resignation letter scrawled hastily on a post-it note. Lena moved to another city, leaving behind her job, her friends, and everything familiar. But distance didn't help. The feeling followed her, the sensation of being watched, of something just out of sight, waiting. She caught glimpses in windows, in puddles, in polished countertops. always the same grin, lingering just long enough to make her doubt her sanity. Months passed. She started seeing a therapist, though she couldn't bring herself to share the truth. Anxiety, she'd say, or nightmares. The therapist nodded, prescribing mindfulness exercises that did little to quiet the whispers in her head. One evening, as she sat on her couch, flipping mindlessly through channels, her phone buzzed with a notification. An ad popped up. "Grand reopening. Come see our fully renovated gym. First month free." Her blood ran cold. The name was different, but the address was the same. The ad featured pictures of shiny new equipment and smiling trainers, but in the background of one photo, barely visible, she swore she saw it. A tall, shadowy figure, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The whispers returned that night, louder than ever. Somewhere far away, the gym's doors opened to new members. A fresh coat of paint covered the walls, and the machines gleamed under bright lights. But in the largest mirror, in the farthest corner, a faint outline waited. It wasn't over. It never would be. If you want to hear more chilling stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what topic we should cover next. We're waiting for your ideas.